Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so you've got this big test coming up on the English colonies, basically everything from 1607 to 1754. We've got the sources, and our job today is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, we need to boil this down for you. Think Test Prep Central. What do you really need to know for those compare and contrast questions, those multiple choice details?
Exactly. We're looking at what made, say, Jamestown totally different from Massachusetts Bay. Motives, labor, religion, all that stuff.
And also what tied them all together, like imperial control, mercantilism, things like salutary neglect, plus shared challenges, slavery, conflict.
We'll hit the key dates, the crucial facts, even some historical art that tells a story. So let's get into it. First stop, Jamestown. The Chesapeake Experiment.
Right, 1607, that's your anchor date for Jamestown. And the absolute key, it was founded by a joint stock company, the Virginia Company.
So like early investors pooling their money.
Precisely. Private money, looking for one thing, profit. They were hoping for gold, basically. Quick riches.
And the people they sent. The sources paint a picture of guys totally unprepared for hardship. Mostly young, single men, right? Gentry types who wouldn't inherit back in England.
Exactly. They expected to manage labor, not do it. They thought they'd find gold lying around, not build shelters and farm.
Which led to disaster pretty quickly. At that term, the starving time, you definitely need to know that.
Oh, absolutely. It was horrific. George Percy's account, it's grim reading. He talks about eating just a bit of boiled barley, dragging bodies out like dogs. It's stark.
And the survival rate, shockingly low. Only 38 out of the first 120 made it through that initial winter.
Just incredible mortality. So what saved them? Wasn't gold.
No, it was tobacco. John Rolfe gets the credit for figuring out how to cultivate a marketable strain. By 1614, they're exporting it.
And tobacco is hugely labor-intensive. This creates this massive demand for workers, which fundamentally shapes the Chesapeake.
Which brings us to indentured servitude. This was the main labor source early on, wasn't it?
It was. Mostly young, poor men from England signing contracts, maybe 5 to 7 years long. In theory, they'd get passage, food, shelter, maybe land at the end.
But the reality was often brutal. The sources say less than 20% survived their contracts in those early years, before 1622.
Yeah, the death rate was still incredibly high. Disease, overwork. It was a tough gamble.
And to get landowners to bring over more indentured servants, they introduced the headright system. This is a classic test concept. How did that work again?
Super simple, super effective. For every person you paid to transport to Virginia, whether an indentured servant, family member, or later an enslaved person, you, the landowner, got 50 acres of land.
50 acres per head. So it directly incentivized importing labor and grabbing land.
Exactly. And pushing rapidly westward right onto Native American territories. That expansion is key.
Okay, and politically, things start to stabilize a bit with the House of Burgesses in 1619, first elected assembly.
First elected assembly for male landowners, yes, big step. But, and this is important, the governor, appointed by the king back in England, still had the final veto. Power was still ultimately top down.
Got it. Okay, now let's shift gears completely. North to New England, this is the major contrast you'll need for any comparison essay.
Right. Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded 1630. Totally different motive. It's Puritan families seeking religious freedom, well, their version of it.
They wanted to purify the Church of England, create this model religious society.
That's the famous phrase from their governor, John Winthrop. A city upon a hill, a religious beacon for the world to see.
And this shaped everything, even how they built their towns. Tight communities, very cohesive.
Yeah, they wanted to keep a close eye on each other, maintain religious purity, watch out for Satan's influence, basically. It's a theocracy, church and state, deeply intertwined.
So different people, different goals. How did that affect life there compared to Jamestown?
Well, they arrived as families, which meant more stability from the start. Conditions were generally better, less disease, more focus on subsistence farming initially. People lived longer.
And the labor system?
Mostly family labor, big families, kids working. The climate wasn't right for huge cash crops like tobacco or sugar, so they didn't need that massive influx of indentured or later enslaved labor like the South did.
Less reliance on enslaved people, definitely. But here's the irony, right? They came seeking religious freedom.
But were incredibly intolerant of anyone who disagreed with their specific brand of Puritanism. Big time.
So who are the key dissenters we need to flag? The ones who got kicked out?
Two major figures, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Williams raised some really challenging questions.
Like questioning their right to just take native land.
Exactly. He argued they should purchase it fairly. And maybe even more radically, he pushed for the separation of church and state.
Okay, but the nuance here, why did he want separation? This trips people up.
He wasn't trying to protect the government from religion. He wanted to protect the church from being corrupted by politics and worldly affairs. Purity of the church was his goal,
So they banished him, and he goes off and founds Rhode Island.
which becomes the first English colony with genuine religious tolerance, a haven for dissenters.
Then there's Anne Hutchinson, a woman challenging the male religious authorities.
Yes, holding theological meetings in her home, questioning ministers' interpretations. Huge challenge to the patriarchal structure. She gets banished too.
And Governor Winthrop's reaction to her later miscarriage. It's chilling,
Yeah.
calling it the baby of Satan.
Shows just how intense and controlling that environment could be. Personal tragedy weaponized for theological points. Horrifying.
So, very different models. Jamestown's profit motive, New England's piety. But they did share some fundamental things as English colonies.
Definitely. Let's tick those off. First, governmentally, all ultimately owned by the crown, ruled by an appointed governor with veto power, even with those local assemblies.
And socially.
Overwhelmingly patriarchy. Societies run by men, power held by men. That was universal.
Culturally, too, they still saw themselves as English, right? This idea of Anglicization.
Absolutely. They read English books. John Locke was huge. They followed English fashion trends. Sources even suggest many colonists, especially merchants, had a higher material standard of living than folks back in England. Clocks, mirrors, multiple shoes, status symbols.
Which connects to the big economic idea holding it all together. Mercantilism. You absolutely have to understand this one.
Non-negotiable. It's the core belief that colonies exist only to enrich the mother country, England, provide raw materials cheaply, buy expensive finished goods from England. That's it.
Keep the wealth within the empire flowing towards the center. Gold and silver were the measures of wealth.
And this was enforced, or supposed to be enforced, by laws like the Navigation Acts. Goods had to be shipped on English ships. Trade restricted to England.
This system generated a lot of wealth, especially from commodities like sugar, tobacco, later cotton.
And you see that wealth reflected in the material culture. Think about those fancy objects that show up in historical analysis. The ornate silver sugar box, the chocolate pot. These weren't just for use. They scream status and connection to that Atlantic trade.
Even colonial-made luxury items, like that salt box by Jeremiah Drummer, America's first native-born silversmith. It shows emerging colonial craft, but still within that English luxury context.
But the enforcement of mercantilism, that's where things get really interesting, leading to salutary neglect.
Right. This period, roughly 1714 to 1750, what exactly was salutary neglect?
It basically means the British Crown, often associated with Prime Minister Robert Walpole, was pretty relaxed about enforcing those strict trade laws, like the Navigation Acts. They kind of looked the other way.
Okay, but why? Why would they not enforce their own rules designed to make them rich?
Couple of big reasons. One, Britain was constantly busy expanding the empire, fighting wars, especially with France. Think King George's War, later the French and Indian War. They were preoccupied.
Resources stretched thin.
Exactly. They didn't really have the manpower, the ships, or frankly, the bureaucratic focus to police every single colonial port effectively. It was expensive and difficult.
And meanwhile, what were the colonists up to?
Getting very good at smuggling, bribing customs officials, finding loopholes, basically ignoring the rules they didn't like.
So this neglect, even though it wasn't an official policy, had a huge impact. It was salutary, meaning beneficial, but maybe unintentionally so, for the colonists' sense of independence.
Monumental impact. Because Britain wasn't cracking down, the colonial assemblies got used to running their own affairs. They handled local taxes, budgets, day-to-day governance.
They stepped into that power vacuum.
They did. And over a couple of generations, this wasn't just convenient, it started to feel like a right. They developed this deep-seated belief in their own capacity and authority to govern themselves.
That's setting the stage for major conflict later, when Britain decides to tighten control again. But before we get there, we have to address the darkest common thread: slavery.
Yes. Crucially, slavery was legal in all 13 English colonies, and it was defined as chattel slavery.
Let's be clear on that term, chattel.
It means movable personal property. Enslaved people were legally classified not as humans, but as items, like livestock or furniture, that could be bought, sold, inherited, and completely controlled by their owner.
A brutal legal definition. But the experience of enslaved people varied quite a bit geographically, right? Especially north versus south.
Big difference, yeah. In the southern colonies, think Virginia, South Carolina, the whole economy was driven by cash crops like tobacco and rice, which required huge amounts of labor. So enslaved populations were massive. South Carolina was nearly 60% enslaved.
And the system there was modeled on the really harsh sugar plantations in the Caribbean, like Barbados?
Exactly. Brutal conditions, high mortality. And because profit was paramount, planters often deliberately broke up families, selling children away. There was also often less effort to Christianize enslaved people, sometimes out of fear it might give them ideas about equality or humanity.
How did the North compare?
Much smaller enslaved population, usually 10% or less. Slavery existed, definitely, but it wasn't the economic engine the way it was in the South. Enslaved people more often worked on docks, in artisan shops, or as domestic servants in homes.
So maybe slightly different conditions?
Generally, yes. Because they weren't on massive, isolated plantations, there might have been more interaction with white society, perhaps more exposure to Christianity. Sometimes a greater chance of forming stable families, though still entirely subject to the owner's whims. Life expectancy tended to be longer than in the disease-ridden South.
But inherent in the system is violence and the denial of freedom, which inevitably leads to resistance. The key example you need to know for the South is the Stoner Rebellion.
1739, South Carolina, the colony with the highest density of enslaved people. This was the largest slave uprising in the mainland colonies during this period.
What happened?
A group of about 80 enslaved people, possibly trying to reach Spanish Florida where they'd heard freedom was offered, armed themselves. They marched south, killing dozens of white colonists, many caught unprepared while attending church.
How did it end?
It was brutally suppressed quite quickly by the colonial militia. But the response is crucial for the test. The South Carolina legislature passed the Negro Act of 1740.
What did that act do?
It drastically tightened restrictions on enslaved people, made it illegal for them to assemble in groups, grow their own food, earn any money, learn to read or write, or even travel freely without a written pass. It was designed to crush any possibility of future uprisings by controlling every aspect of life.
A real clampdown, solidifying that oppressive system. Okay, now let's pivot to a different kind of explosion, a different kind of fear this time in the North. Salem witch trials.
1692, the most famous outbreak, right there in Puritan, Massachusetts. 19 people executed for witchcraft. A short, intense period of hysteria.
When you're studying this for the test, the causes are complex, right? It wasn't just one thing. Historians point to several factors converging.
Exactly. First, you have the underlying religious hysteria, this deep Puritan belief that Satan was real, actively trying to undermine their city upon a hill, and that witches were his agents, often believed to take the form of women.
So, a pre-existing framework to interpret strange events.
Definitely. Second, add the context of warfare trauma. They were dealing with brutal, ongoing wars with Native Americans on the frontiers, like King Philip's War not long before. Constant fear, anxiety, a sense of being under siege.
That makes sense. Heightened anxiety, looking for scapegoats. What else?
There were internal social and cultural conflicts, tensions between the more established, often wealthier people in Salem town versus the poorer farmers in Salem village. Also, maybe anxieties about women who were challenging traditional roles, gaining economic independence.
So community tensions boiling over. And then there's the more biological theory.
The ergot theory. Yeah, this is fascinating. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on damp rye or wheat. If ingested, it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, muscle spasms, symptoms quite similar to what the afflicted girls in Salem described.
So possibly a physical cause for the initial accusations, interacting with all those social and religious fears.
It's a compelling part of the puzzle. It likely wasn't just ergot, but it could have been a trigger in that specific environment, especially after a wet growing season.
What's striking is how abruptly it all stopped after 1692.
It really did. It's like the community collectively woke up. There was a wave of apologies, acknowledgments of terrible injustice. The courts stopped accepting spectral evidence. A real moment of communal reckoning.
It really shows the extremes of colonial life, intense piety, intense fear, violence, but also these moments of self-correction, maybe.
Absolutely. Greed in Jamestown, piety and fear in Salem, the brutal economics of slavery, the growing self-reliance under salutary neglect. It's all part of that early American mix.
Okay, let's wrap this up and connect the dots for your test prep. The big takeaway. The colonies were definitely not all the same. Huge differences in why they were founded, who lived there, how they made money.
Right. Jamestown versus Massachusetts is your classic example. Profit versus piety. Indentured servants versus family labor. Spread out plantations versus tight-knit towns.
But they were connected. By English law, by the crown, by that economic theory of mercantilism, even if it wasn't always strictly enforced, and by shared experiences like patriarchy and, tragically, the institution of slavery.
And that brings us back to salutary neglect. This is probably the most critical concept connecting this period to what comes next. Britain's distraction allowed the colonies over 2 generations to get really good at governing themselves.
They saw it as practical. The colonists started seeing it as their inherent right.
Exactly. Britain viewed the colonies as assets that could mostly run themselves while the empire fought its wars. The colonists, meanwhile, developed legislatures, managed budgets, and built a political culture based on local control.
Which leaves us with the big question moving forward, the one you should really ponder. When King George III and Parliament decide, after 1763, that it's time to crack down, enforce those navigation acts, and tax the colonies to pay for imperial defense.
How deep does that colonial belief in self-governance actually run? How much had that American fabric of mind, that sense of independence nurtured by decades of neglect, truly taken root?
Can the mother country just flip a switch and take back control that colonists believe they've earned?
That's the friction point. How easily can you put the genie back in the bottle after letting it out for 50 years? Thinking about that tension is key to understanding the road to revolution.